Okay. So what is Christian pacifism? Well, as usual, let's start with some assumptions. So the concept of Christian pacifism comes specifically from a quotation from the Bible, from Matthew chapter 5. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. And so the word pacifism actually comes from the same word that is used in that Bible verse. It's in the Latin though. So in Latin, the first phrase, blessed are the peacemakers, is Dei Pacifici or something. I don't speak Latin. And so it comes, the word pacifici comes from pax, which means peace, and ficus or ficus meaning making. So it's literally peacemaking. So pacifism is peacemaking. But something that's really important, I think, when we're thinking about pacifism is to remember that pacifism does not just mean opposing war. Pacifism is not a negative definition. Pacifism requires some kind of action. Pacifists are not passive, even though pacifism and pacifism and pacifism sound very, very similar. They are not the same thing. Being passive means accepting or allowing things to be. When we use the passive voice when we speak, where we are indicating that the subject is being acted upon rather than acting on their own. And so we have to make sure that we differentiate this idea, because it's very common in our just general population for people to assume that pacifism means that you just sit back and let everything happen to you or to others and you don't do anything about it. But that's not necessarily true. For the most part, pacifists believe that violence is morally wrong in all or at least some or most situations. So that's kind of a basic definition of pacifism. It's about a belief system, it's a philosophy. But there are different kinds of pacifism. So I want to talk just a little bit about those before we get into our class. So there, and pacifism comes from a variety of different backgrounds and philosophies. It's not just for Christians, but Christian pacifists obviously base their understanding of why they are pacifists in Christianity, in the Christian Bible. But in general, generally speaking, there are different kinds of pacifism. There is absolute pacifism. Absolute pacifism, if you believe in absolute pacifism, it means that killing a person deliberately, even in self-defense, is never justified because of the inherent value of human life. So it's very cut and dried, black and white. You do not kill another person. You do not harm another person, ever, 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 even if your own life is on the line. And I find this interesting because it seems to hold even some kind of contradiction within it. Because if the reason why you never kill is because human life is so valuable, then allowing yourself to be killed is kind of defeating the purpose in a way, isn't it? Because your life is a human life just as much as anyone else's. And so when you're talking about, I'm not going to kill anybody, that's one thing, but I'm not going to do anything to prevent myself from being killed, I think kind of gets a little bit too far, maybe, to me. But there are people who ascribe to this. But I think it also seems a bit too simple to me. We can start asking deep philosophical questions. We can say, well, if the goal of pacifism is to lift up the value of human life, And we get ourselves into a situation like, you can always go to Hitler because he's a favorite. He's just, the example of deep and unmitigated evil. Wouldn't it be better to kill Hitler and have one person die than to sit back and allow him to kill millions of people, if the idea is that human life is valuable? And so really, I think at the end of the day, absolute pacifism, in my interpretation, is a very selfish, self-centered kind of thing, that it's about my personal moral purity and actually doesn't have anything to do with the philosophy that I espouse. And this is my interpretation. It's negative interpretation, but as long as I don't kill anyone, then I can maintain my moral purity. As long as I don't harm anyone. If you are harming someone, I have no obligation to stop you from doing that. But because it's about me. And if I try to stop you from doing that, I might commit violence, and then my soul is tarnished in some way. And so it's not really, in my opinion, it's not really about morals and ethics. It's about me. It's about how I feel about myself and whether I can, be morally upright or not. And so I have a huge problem with the absolute pacifism. But there are other kinds of pacifism. There are strains that call themselves militant or active pacifists. In these cases, the concept is that we uphold these tenets of opposition to violence, opposition to war, support of human life, support of peace, but you're not just going to sit there and talk about it. You're going to use every peaceful method possible to oppose violence and war in an active way. You're going to focus on advocating against violence and war in whatever way you can that is not violent or warlike in and of itself in terms of your tactics. And so this type of pacifism, starts to get at the blurriness, the murkiness of real human life. That there is a philosophy to uphold, there is a position, and that you're trying to live by, but the understanding that in order to actually live by it, you can't just sit back and let things happen. You have to participate. You have to actively oppose that which you believe is wrong. But that the ends do not justify the means. You can't use violence to oppose violence. You have to do something else. And so then you have to just figure out, what is violence? Is it just physically harming another person? Is it just killing someone else? As long as you don't kill them, you can do whatever physical harm you want. Is it does it go beyond physical harm? Does it include emotional harm or social harm or economic harm? How do we define violence, and what is it about violence that we are against? So you kind of have to ask deeper and more difficult questions if you're going to actually act on your philosophical position. And so that makes it a lot harder, but I think it's more realistic and it's more meaningful in terms of how you can use it in real life. So the next kind of pacifism is called conditional pacifism, and conditional pacifists still believe that violence and war are pretty wrong, but they accept that there are some circumstances when war could lead to less suffering and therefore could be defensible in terms of a moral position. So this kind of person would be the type that says, it would have been wrong for the United States to sit back knowing that they had the military might to defeat Hitler, but not do it because because of this philosophy. It's not, they needed to take military action in order to stop the atrocities that were being committed. And so there's a sense that generally speaking, you want to avoid war, avoid violence. You're certainly not going to instigate it yourself. But if the only way to stop someone's violence or stop someone's warring is to be violent back, then in some sort of situations that's okay and can be morally defensible.
What about our situation right now with Russia? We're being asked to protect Ukraine, and yet, they don't want to do anything active because it could cause further war.
Mm-hmm.
They're kind of in a pickle there. I mean,
yeah. So you have to decide, certainly, and we're going to talk a lot more about this, but, governments really can't be in the business of pacifist philosophy for the most part. Maybe Switzerland has perfected that somehow through their reputation, but generally speaking, I don't think that and again, like I said, we're going to talk about this more, but I don't think that governments are in the business of pacifism, but they have to try to, even if it's not a moral argument, they have to argue for the reasons why they do things. They have to justify to the voters, to their constituents, why they made this decision to put the lives of Americans on the line or what have you. And is it the job of the United States to police the world?
Right, that's the argument.
Yeah, why if you say yes, well, why is America the moral judge of everything? And if you say no, then is it okay for us to just sit back and let other people suffer because we're not involved in that and that's not our problem? So conditional pacifists would say that there are situations where it is appropriate to step in and lead to less suffering in the end. But you don't always know what your actions are going to do. Like in this situation, if the United States, or, in my opinion, I think it's more appropriate for like the UN to step in because that's the role of that body. It's not for individual nations to get involved in their international conflicts, but that is literally what the UN is for. So if somebody were to step in, then conditional pacifists would say, well, yeah, that could be morally defensible, but how do we know if that action is going to lead to less suffering? How do we know that it's not going to lead to more suffering? Because then that will instigate Russia to attack other countries or, kind of lead to a third world war. And we don't know, you don't know until you do it, right? So conditional pacifism is really hard because, sure, in retrospect, you can look back and you can say, well, yes, of course it was right for America to get involved in World War II, or of course it was right for the North to be involved in the Civil War, to free the slaves and reestablish our country. But in the moment, can you say whether or not a certain action is going to lead to less suffering? I don't think you can. So that's tough too.
Okay.
So the last kind of pacifism that I mean, you can divide it all in all kinds of different ways, but the last one that I want to share is called selective pacifism. And selective pacifists are kind of pacifist light in a way, I guess. Selective pacifists focus only on weapons of mass destruction, basically, things that hurt all living things in the natural world as a whole, rather than just humans. And it's not, selective pacifists aren't, anti-human or anything like that. They just believe that, people make decisions and they need to deal with the consequences of their decisions. And so they don't really care if, person X shoots person Y because they're in a fight with each other, that's their problem. But what you can't do is injure innocent bystanders. And many selective pacifists are also naturalists or stewardship of creation kind of people. And so their big focus often is on like nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, biological weapons, things that hurt not just the people that are involved in the conflict, but the natural world, and sometimes people who aren't involved in the conflict they care about too. So it's about certain types of warring, certain types of violence that they think kind of go too far in terms of the damaging abilities of those weapons. So there's just a few different reflections on types of pacifism that can be true of any Christian or non-Christian. There are different types of religious supports, depending on what religion you ascribe to for pacifism, and any of those could fit into these categories. So these are not mutually exclusive to Christian pacifism. A Christian pacifist could ascribe to any of these. So questions about any of that introductory stuff before we move into Christian pacifism?
Well, there's a designation for military service where someone can declare themselves a pacifist, and there's a definition of that, and I'm not familiar with what it is, but basically it comes down to I don't believe in killing,
Conscientious objection.
Yeah. And but they still serve.
Some of them do. We're going to talk about that a little bit too.
Yeah. I mean, Muhammad Ali didn't, but I admire people who stand up for what they believe that way. I mean, it's difficult to do that because you're really going against the tide, so to speak.
I have some interesting stuff about that too. We're going to get into all kinds of fun stuff.
I'm getting ahead of you. I'm sorry.
That's okay. All right. So let's first just kind of talk a little bit about Christian pacifism in particular, because that was the question. And where do we get the source of Christian pacifism? Well, we find the reasons for our pacifism in the Bible. So pacifism itself is about opposition to war, opposition to violence, support of peace. But Christian pacifism is that. And why do I believe that? Because of my faith. And so let's look at where some of this comes from. So the first place I want to look at is Exodus chapter 20, verse 13, which starts with, "Thou shalt not." Anybody know how that finishes?
No.
Kill. Or
it's kill, isn't it?
There's kill, but there's also murder, depending on your translation. So thou shalt not kill, or sometimes thou shalt not murder. So what is that about? Well, the word in Hebrew that appears there is ratzach, which is just as complicated and mixed as our use of the word kill. So ratzach could refer to a deliberate killing of someone else. It could refer to an accidental killing of someone else. It could refer to, killing in battle. Any of these different types of killing could be interpreted in this way. But some translations choose to use the word murder rather than the word kill, because killing, just like ratzach, is very vague. It could refer to anything. And so if it's it's a very stark, do not kill anyone, period, end of story. I don't care what the situation is. But by changing it to murder, some translations are kind of giving us a little bit of an out. Well, it says do not murder, And murder is, murder is not murder is not justifiable death. Murder is outside of the bounds of just war, if that's a thing. And so if you are, if you kill someone but you're doing it in self-defense, that's not murder. If you kill someone but you're doing it because you're in the army and you're defending your nation and you're being asked to do that, that's not murder. Those types of wiggle rooms are provided by that translation of that one word from kill to murder. And so I think it's really important that we think about that and wonder about that, because Ratzak, the original intention of the passage, is period, end of story, no killing. Maybe. It's got all those vague elements to it, but it could also potentially be murder. And so it all depends on your perspective. It all depends on your position in relationship to pacifism. Is it ever okay to kill someone? And if it is, then maybe you choose murder so that you can have that conversation about in what situations is it okay. And if it's not, then you probably put kill, so that it's just very clear from the get-go that the Bible tells us that we can't kill anyone for any reason. So even the most basic, this is literally 2 words in the original Hebrew, 4 words or 3 words, depending on if you're talking about King James or modern English. And even within that, it gets complicated when you're trying to figure out what you want it to say. So next, I want to look at Isaiah chapter 2, which tells us, God shall judge between the nations and shall arbitrate for many peoples. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. So this is kind of an oracle of, what the future might look like, what the kingdom of God might look like, an understanding of how God wants things to be, how things someday will be, hopefully. And so this passage is often used to defend the idea that God is a pacifist. God does not want us to war against each other. There is a guy in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, who literally does this. He takes gun donations from people and he literally turns them into garden tools. He takes this very literally. And so he's got a little, what's that place called with the anvil and the
a blacksmith?
Yes. He's got like a little blacksmith shop at his house, and people donate the guns that they come across or that they've had in their family, and he turns them into garden hose and rakes and all sorts of different things. And the purpose of that is to express his commitment to this passage and to contributing toward bringing that truth, bringing that reality in, bringing that promise into reality in this world. But then we also have passages where, God calls for violence. God tells the people to attack all of these nations and kill everyone down to the last dog and cow and cat, let alone child or woman or man. And so it's complicated. We had a whole class on that.
Yeah.
All right, so next we're going to shift to some Christian Testament stuff. And we have Matthew chapter 5. Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. So this is a very contentious passage in terms of what it means. What is it that Jesus is
Right.
trying to say here? The part about the eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth comes from Leviticus chapter 24, which talks about how, justice is, well, if my enemy has attacked me and my eye got gouged out, then that person should also lose an eye, to show them, kind of what it feels like. So that's the reference there. But what Jesus is trying to get at here, nobody can really agree. One thing that I think is important is that word resist. Do not resist an evildoer. The word resist is weighted in the original Greek, just like it is for us today. We use that word resist for political reasons. People have bumper stickers that say resist, whatever it is that they're trying to resist in terms of, political leadership or social social positions. They want to resist is an active thing. It's not just, have an opinion that's different. It's be active in trying to turn this thing around. It means the same thing in Greek. Or, the newer Star Wars movies use this. The resistance is the group of the good guys, the Jedi, that are opposed to the First Order, which is kind of like the Darth Vader movement. And so resistance is a loaded word that Jesus is using here. And so some scholars take that and they look at this passage within the context of the larger sermon that Jesus is giving. And they think that this passage is maybe about repentance, that the word resistance was used frequently at the time in terms of Jews who were trying to resist the Roman Empire. They would call people to resist resist what the enemy is doing. And so Jesus might be making some kind of reference to that. For example, the last line there, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Lots of scholars say, and I don't know if this is true or not, it's just one of those kind of accepted things, that in the Roman world, if you were not a Roman citizen, you could have a Roman soldier conscript you into carrying his stuff for him, but he could not force you to go more than 1 mile. And 1 mile to a Roman was 1,000 paces. So if he was tired and didn't feel like carrying his stuff anymore, he had to keep on walking with his regiment or his whatever group he was with. But he could make a random citizen carry his stuff for him. But by law, he could only make them carry it for 1,000 paces. And so in that case, Jesus is actually suggesting breaking the law, kind of a nonviolent resistance kind of thing, because the law says that they can't go more than 1 mile. And so if you go 2 miles, then that person could get into trouble for you having done that. So some people kind of see it as kind of an underhanded way to wiggle through. But others kind of take it more from a personal piety, but not just piety, personal, what's the word I'm looking for? Who I am in relationship to God and how that comes out in the way that I live my life. And so those people suggest that these examples that Jesus is giving, we think, we kind of automatically assume that what Jesus is describing is unfair punishments or unfair actions in the case of someone. And so it says, if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. We assume that strike was not justified. But some interpreters kind of take a different route, and they think maybe it was justified. And so the thought is that Jesus is saying, do not resist an evildoer. There's no point in resisting or defending yourself against a more powerful enemy. All that's going to do is make things worse. But there is a point in humbling yourself before God. So if you have done something wrong to deserve some kind of punishment, then you should show remorse for that by paying double what is owed. If someone hits you deservedly, then you should say, yes, I deserved that. You should hit me again. If you are not taking care of the needy as you should, as a good follower of the way, then the way that you remedy that is by going above and beyond. If someone sues you to take your coat, we think, oh, well, that's a bad lawsuit because I didn't do anything wrong to lose my coat to deserve that. But if I did, if I'm not doing my due diligence as a Christian to take care of those who need a coat, and they try to take my coat from me because I wouldn't give it to them in the first place, like I should have, then in order to make amends for that, then I should also give them my cloak. I should double my payment. If I am forced into some kinds of assistance to someone because I haven't served them well enough, and so now they are in greater need, and so now I'm being forced to do it, that should be a moment of clarity for me. Oh, I haven't been doing this. I haven't been supporting people who are in need. And so if I have been refusing to serve, now I need to double my efforts to show true repentance for my lack of doing what it is that God has asked me to do. So that's a very different interpretation of this. It's not it's not the same as, well, I didn't do anything wrong and people are harming me. It's not about persecution necessarily. It's about making amends for previously not doing God's will in your life. And so, how do we want to interpret this? There's not any way to know, which one it is or isn't here. But I think that's an interesting thing and an important thing to keep in mind as we move forward with this. So questions, comments on that?
It's really confusing.
Yes. All right.
I'm not sure I understand.
That's okay. So last one I want to bring is 1 Peter chapter 2. For the Lord's sake, accept the authority of every human institution, whether of the emperor as supreme or of governors, as sent by him to punish those who do wrong and praise those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing right, you should silence the ignorance of the foolish. If you endure while you are beaten for doing wrong, what credit is that? But if you endure when you do right and suffer for it, you have God's approval. So this one, I think, is about what a lot of people think the last one was about. It's about, being the calm presence in the face of anger, being the nonviolent presence in the face of violence, not retaliating, because you know that it's not going to do anything to retaliate. All it's going to do is rile up your enemy, and they're the ones that have the power. The governor or the emperor can do whatever they want to you. And so if you fight against them, then all that's going to do is make things worse. But if you don't fight against them, then that gives you credit with God, and it shows the world, who you are. And so that's the kind of thing I think that we're used to hearing about these kinds of interpretations.
What
So
about
this
the
kind of
sentence where it
go
says,
ahead, Jim.
For it's God's will that by doing right you should silence the ignorance of the foolish.
Mhm.
Right? That is a selective pacifism sentence. Is that what you say about that?
What's that?
Would you say that's selective pacifism?
Um, doing right.
Well, I'm wrong one, I'm sorry. Conditional pacifism.
Maybe in terms of, when we talk about what is pacifism, if your understanding of pacifism extends all the way to, hurting the little feelings of your enemies, then certainly doing the right thing, even in the face of someone who's doing the wrong thing, sends a message, not just to them, but to everyone who's watching. So there's that. It could also be interpreted as militant or active pacifism in terms of, not using every nonviolent means that you can to resist, resist violence, resist war.
I keep thinking about Martin Luther King.
We're going to talk about him in just a minute.
Oh.
Carrie can just teach my class today.
Well, it keeps making me think of it because if you take a position like he did, the whole world watches,
Mhm.
So yeah, okay. I'm sorry.
Nope, that's okay. So before I get to him, I want to talk about a couple other things. And I originally called this section a history of Christian pacifism, but that's not really true because we don't have time to go through the whole thing. So I just want to highlight a couple of small things in terms of what's happened with Christian pacifism in history. So I want to just make a few comments about the early Christian martyrs. So we just looked at First Peter, which in our First Peter class, we talked about how First Peter is a letter to a community of Christians who are experiencing persecution, and not just, oh, you can't worship, but potentially real physical violence against their community, possibly. And so that kind of leads us into this conversation about early Christian martyrs, because during the first couple of centuries of Christianity, most of the time it was just kind of pockets of persecution by individual governors in different regions, until we get to the time of like Nero, where there's a real concerted effort against Christians. The writers of the time, the Christian writers, talked a lot about the importance of martyrdom. Willingness to sacrifice your life leads to the conversion of others because they see how important your faith is to you. The desire to die for your faith is the ultimate act of imitating Christ. And so people who were martyred were considered to be the only true Christians for a certain period of time in the early church. Willingness to die for the truth is the ultimate testimony. What you do with your life, what you do with your body is testifying to the world of who God is. And so that was seen as kind of the best thing that could happen to you is that you die for your faith. There was even a time when there was a lot of arguing about who could be a leader in the church, because as the persecutions became more widespread, you had people who believed that if you did not experience some kind of persecution, you weren't a real Christian. And so there were some areas where, for example, if you wanted to be a bishop, you had to have had bestowed on you the title of confessor. And confessors was just a different category in terms of martyrs. Martyrs were people who actually died, who were killed because of their faith. Confessors were people who had been tortured in some way or persecuted, but didn't actually die. So they didn't get to have the martyr label put on them because they were still alive, poor them, but they got this other secondary title called confessor. And there were some places where it was believed that if you hadn't gone through something like that, then you couldn't call yourself a real Christian. And so you couldn't be a leader in the church.
Wow.
Very hardcore. And then there was a whole big conversation and debate about people who recanted. They were, the governor would bring you before the panel of judges and ask you, are you a Christian? Well, yes, I am. Okay, well, if you recant, if you say, I'm not going to follow that faith anymore, if you make a sacrifice to the emperor, then we'll let you go. But if you refuse to do that, then we're going to, throw you to the lions or whatever it is that is the entertainment du jour. And so when people succumb to that, when people recanted to save their own lives, how do we deal with them? Do they, do they get to then come back into the fold later, or is it too late? Have they already kind of given up their identity as Christians and their salvation? And this was a huge moment in terms of what it meant to be a Christian, when they decided that yes, you can repent of your refusal to die for your faith, but a lot of times people who had done that could never be leaders of the church in their lifetime, because they hadn't made that ultimate sacrifice. They hadn't imitated Christ properly. And so all of this just seems incredibly extreme, in some ways. If the only way to be a real Christian is to be dead, then that kind of causes some problems for the proliferation of your group, right? So, but I think we have to see this within its historical context. These people had literally no power, none. These governors could do whatever they wanted to them. And so they had to decide how they were going to respond to the power of the governor. They couldn't just say, well, we have some power too, and so we're going to manipulate the situation in XYZ way. They had to find some kind of meaning in all of the suffering that they were experiencing and all the powerlessness that they had, while also, trying to find ways to move forward as a community. And so it makes sense that they did it this way. It makes sense that they moved through it this way. And you notice that, we aren't still in that same place today. And so clearly they worked through it. And eventually when it wasn't so dangerous to be a Christian anymore, this kind of fell away. But to say, oh, well, you didn't die for any reason at all, really doesn't give people any kind of support when they're in that, situation. And so it makes sense that they would say, yes, if you are in that situation and they're questioning you, you should support your faith. You shouldn't recant. You should accept the consequences of that power system that is oppressing you. And if you die, then you are attaining this kind of glory that those of us who are alive never could. That makes sense to kind of give people that kind of support in the face of just complete powerlessness. But from our perspective, it's a little weird.
Yeah.
All right. So now I want to jump forward several centuries and talk a little bit about a few of the different groups that have taken on the concept of pacifism. So, the martyrs, they didn't really have a choice in the matter. I mean, what could they have done? Like picked up their pitchforks and sticks and tried to attack the emperor of the Roman Empire? There was the power differential there was just too great. And so they didn't really have a choice but to kind of be pacifists in response to it. I guess they could have, tried to have an uprising or whatever, but all that would have done is just stamp them down even further and bring even more suffering to them. And so that made a lot of sense. But over the course of time, as Christianity, turned into kind of the power into the power itself, how do we we then start to have our Christian faith interacting with secular governments? And so there are lots of examples of Christian denominations that have taken on a pacifist perspective, whether it's, individuals within that denomination or the denomination as a whole. But I just wanted to lift up two of them. The first one is the most famous pacifist group, the Quakers. They are always conscientious objectors when it comes to any kind of war and conscription into war. But Quakers will usually serve as non-combatants. They'll serve as medics or sling bearers or fixers of equipment sometimes, things like that. They just don't want to be active, active combatants. But there's another group called the Christa Delphians. And this group developed during the time of the Civil War. And this is an interesting group because they are one of the very few, possibly the only denomination that was actually formed over the issue of pacifism. And they're still around. There aren't very many of them. I think there are like 50,000 total all around the world, but they still exist. And they developed in the time of the Civil War because they refused to be conscripted into the Civil War. And Christa Delphians are much more absolute pacifists than the Quakers are. They refuse all forms of military service, including non-combatant positions, including even like being a medic, somebody who kind of does the opposite of killing, trying to save lives. Instead, they chose to do civilian types of support activities, growing food and supporting orphans of people who died in wars and things like that. And so they're an interesting group that still to this day has things to say, and they kind of became big again during World War I and World War II with their ideas about not participating in war in any way, shape, or form. So then lastly, within our kind of history of Christian pacifism, I want to talk to you about Martin Luther King Jr. And this is, I put pacifism versus active resistance. Martin Luther King was not a passive pacifist. And that's something that I think we miss a lot in our kind of mainline interpretation of his life. He actually had a lot of criticism for pacifist perspectives. He himself had an understanding that pacifism was about that traditional understanding of kind of the turn the other cheek, where you're making yourself look good in the face of someone doing violence against you. He believed that those kind of perspectives relied too much on the goodness and morality of the human heart. He thought that seeing an innocent person getting attacked is not going to turn public opinion. It doesn't work because people don't have enough heart. They don't care about that. So that's actually not what he was trying to do. And a lot of times, even up to today, that's how his work was interpreted. That the idea was that you take these bodies of these humans and you place them in front of the enemy and allow them to be brutalized in some way. That he was looking for the media coverage of the people kneeling in prayer and being attacked by police dogs or things like that. But he actually didn't think that those kinds of tactics worked because he didn't believe that humans watching that, he didn't have enough faith in the goodness and the conscience of the people that would be watching that. He didn't think that they would respond because they wouldn't care, because that's humans are evil and at the heart of it. And so that's not what he was trying to do. What he was actually trying to do is he understood that force should only be seen as a last resort. And so he thought that the Civil War was right. He thought that the Second World War was right. He believed that defending the defenseless is a right thing to do. He believed that stopping evil is the right thing to do. And so he would not be considered an absolute pacifist. Perhaps we could call him not selective. What was the other one that started with a C?
Conditional.
Conditional, thank you. Conditional pacifist. But he called his movement militant. He called it coercive. He called it realistic. And so I think he would have chosen at this point, if we could talk to him today, he maybe would call himself a militant and conditional pacifist, if at all. One big difference between what King was doing and what pacifism typically calls for is that he did not expect personal purity and perfection in the face of abuse like a pacifist would. He didn't tell his people, go over there and be perfect. Don't retaliate. Don't let the media narrative turn against you, because that wasn't the point. The point was to use discipline, yes, but also to use timing to control the media narrative, to make their demonstrations successful. And so they were doing everything in their power to use nonviolent means to send their message, to get across what it was that they were trying to get across. So it wasn't actually about the pacifism itself. It was about using those nonviolent means to get what they needed to get. Why? Because it was the same kind of situation as those martyrs. They had no power, and so they couldn't use power. It would never work. All it would do is rile things up even more and make it even worse for the people that he was trying to help. And so instead of using violent methods, he used political organizing. He used economic pressure. He believed that there is power in numbers from that perspective, even if there isn't military power, even if there isn't violent power. And so King wasn't actually a pacifist, but he used pacifist principles because he knew that violent principles were not going to get anybody anywhere. And so maybe he was a pacifist. He just didn't know it.
Well, but he sought out places where, I mean, he just didn't just walk around town waiting for somebody to attack him.
Right.
He
exactly.
set himself up, and he set other people up in positions where they would be seen. And just like you said, he used the media and the political power. Well, he didn't have any political power, but
organized.
But it wasn't that he didn't just stand by and wait for something to happen.
Right.
So in that sense, yeah, he was militant.
Yeah.
But his methods, did they fall under pacifism? No.
So pacifism is a philosophy, not a strategy. And so you kind of have to interpret, what is the goal of what King was doing with his movement. I think you could say he was using some pacifist strategies, but like I said, pacifism is not a strategy. Pacifism is a philosophy. And so what was the point of it? I don't think it had anything to do with pacifism. I think it had to do with practicality and reality and what worked. Because what he did made more change in a shorter amount of time than at any other time in the history of racial justice.
Right.
And economic justice. So it worked. But does that make him a pacifist? I think pacifism has to be about the philosophy. It has to be about why you're doing the things you're doing.
And you don't think that's why he was doing it?
I don't think so. I think he was doing it because it worked strategically.
Okay.
I think that if he thought that, giving a gun to every Black and poor person in America would change racial inequality, he would have done it. But he knew that wouldn't do anything. He knew it wouldn't work. And so he did something else. But I
Okay.
don't know. We could ask his daughter. She would be able to tell us better than I could.
Well, I don't know. I mean,
She was really young when he died, though. So
yeah. So he became a martyr.
yes.
He
All right.
got a lot of criticism too.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Today we've really watered him down and made him seem like this, happy little story for kids to learn about in elementary school. But yeah, the real story is quite a bit different.
Yeah.
So let's get even more crazy here and talk a little bit about radical pacifism, radical Christian pacifism. Pacifism as a gateway to anarchy. So I've got two characters to introduce you to today in terms of this. The first one is Aiden Ballou or Aiden Bayou. I don't know how you say his name. He is a figure from the Civil War era, and he wrote a treatise called Standard of Practical Christianity. And he was a pacifist. He believed that dependence on force to maintain order is morally wrong. You cannot use force to maintain order. You have to use peaceful means. And he also believed that if you participate in governments that use force or resort to physical violence, then you are participating in the immorality of that government. He believed that even you taking up violent activity to defend yourself against such a government, even up to them killing you, is wrong. And so he established this concept that you cannot allow yourself to be dependent upon the use of force to maintain order in your life, and you can't depend on a government that uses force to protect you. So he was an absolute pacifist. And the reason I bring him up is because he was very influential to another figure named Ammon Hennessy. And Ammon Hennessy was mostly kind of like a World War II era figure. But he lived until 1970, and so he was even involved in speaking out against the Vietnam War and things like that. And he kind of took all of this to its radical conclusion. So if you believe that dependence on force to maintain order is morally wrong, if you believe that violence of any kind is wrong, if you believe that governments that depend on violence to maintain their power are wrong, then you shouldn't support them in any way. And so Ammon Hennessy refused to enroll in the draft for World War II. He refused to pay federal taxes because our federal taxes help to support the military. And he established a whole set of lifestyle guides to help people to avoid owing taxes. So regardless of what you make, you give most of it away so that when you claim your taxes, you don't have to pay any, so that you don't get yourself into trouble. But he was a tax evader. He was a draft dodger. He believed that you should limit your connections to the government, limit your dependence on the government, and certainly do not support the government in any way that you can get away with, because the government is participating in this evil use of violence for supporting its own power. And so Christian anarchy is a thing. It exists out there, and we could talk about that one day too. The idea that that the kingdom of God is the only government that a Christian should maintain loyalty to. That that Christians should not participate in any kind of form of government at all, because all governments, and in the case of a Christian pacifist anarchist, because all governments have no choice but to use violence and war to maintain their power. And so therefore, by participating in that, you are morally responsible. Especially, it's even worse in a democracy, even because you have power, you have control over that. And so you have liability in that. And so pacifism can lead into Christian anarchy if you follow the logical progression deeply enough. So interesting characters that if you're interested, we could talk more about in a future study. So any questions, comments about any of that?
So how does this relate to supporting your government? I mean, I'm struggling with this for a little bit. If you don't approve of these things and you decide not to support your government in this thing, like these people were suggesting, then who does decide what's morally right and wrong? Who does decide that?
Interesting.
And if you don't follow the rules that the government has set up, because do they have the right to set up the rules? I don't know. But anarchy is not right. So there's got to be something in the middle where you follow the government and the laws, but if your government declares war, like what's happened in Russia right now, the Russians are protesting that act because they don't believe that their government should have done that.
Mm-hmm.
They're not doing it to be a pacifist. They're doing it because they think their government is wrong. I don't know. It's all confused. I mean, I don't know how you decide where you're supposed to be.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's a challenge. It's why I called this slide "Pacifism: A Gateway Drug to Anarchy," because if you think purely logically, if you only use logic and just talk about it in a vacuum without thinking about reality, then it makes sense, right? If it's wrong, if the Bible tells us that it's wrong to kill in any situation, and that we always need to, if we always need to maintain that moral purity, but then we live in under a government that does those things, then they have kind of given up their moral authority by making those choices because it's wrong to kill. And so if they've given up their moral authority, then we shouldn't have to, listen to them anymore. We can establish our own thing. And that would be an interesting conversation to have about Christian anarchy and who is in charge, because you can't really have a society without somebody being in charge, right? So who gets to decide? So it logically follows. But when it comes to, real life, we start asking all these questions. Okay, well, if that's the case, then, is it okay for me to drive on the roads that the government provides? Is it okay for me to drive in the car that the government provides safety features and requirements for? Is it okay for me to, use the cell phone service that the government provides for cell phone companies to give, towers to? How far do we go with this? Do I have to just go live in the middle of nowhere and Saskatchewan and never talk to anybody or do anything in order to,
That's what a lot of people are doing.
yeah, in order to be a good Christian. No, that doesn't seem right either, because now, and that kind of goes back to what we were talking about with absolute pacifism. Is it right for me to just say, well, I am morally pure because I live out in the middle of nowhere, but I know that all these other people are suffering and I could be doing something about it if I would, get involved. And so then it becomes, are Christians supposed to be separate? Are we supposed to go and live in a cult somewhere away from the world and let the world do what it's going to do? Or do we have an obligation to be in the world, but have a different perspective on what the world should look like? And then work for that within the system, get our hands dirty, get our souls dirty a little bit, because there are going to be situations where there is no good answer when you get into the messiness of human life. And so, what's more important? Is it about that, being able to sit there with your crown on your head and say, yes, I am morally pure, I've never killed anyone or participated in killing anyone? Or is it more important to, serve justice, to love mercy, to walk humbly with God in doing something about the problems? And that's a whole debate.
If you think not just about war, but about capital punishment, where on earth did that ever become okay? The Bible says, thou shalt not kill. Where does that even become?
So that's another example of how we reinterpret that with the word murder. Well, if we say you shall not murder, well, it's not murder if you're in a war. It's also not murder if it's, the state deciding that this person's punishment is death.
Why is it not?
Interpretation.
Why is that not murder?
Oh, in my personal opinion, it still is, but other people can say it's not because, you justify it. Murder is an intentional act of killing someone that is not morally justified. But it's morally justified if the person did a horrible thing. It's morally justified if that person's trying to kill me. It's morally justified if I'm doing it on behalf of my government to save people's lives or, whatever.
Okay.
So that's the logic of that, the attempted logic of that. But I don't agree.
Yeah, I don't either.
But nobody asked me.
Is that based upon morals or is it based upon law? You were saying that it's morally right to kill somebody because it's war. It's morally right because I was protecting myself.
Well, so that can be part of the philosophical conversation too, right? That, is it about what's morally right, or is it about, following the laws of the government that has been placed over you? And the Bible has all kinds of weird things to say about that too, and contradictory things. Well, God has put that government over you, and so you need to follow the laws of that government and do what they say, because that God,
Right.
they have that divine mandate to rule. Just their very existence means that God put them there to do what it is that they're doing right now. I don't believe that to be the case, but some people would interpret it that way.
I don't interpret it that way either.
So
do you know there's been some television shows, I guess, the one I think of is Dexter, where I guess I have never watched it, but I've been told that he is a good guy because he only kills bad guys.
Yeah, isn't he like a serial killer, but he only kills bad guys or something? Yeah,
right. He kills people that have done really horrible things, but the government hasn't taken care of them. He hasn't been arrested. They haven't been arrested or anything, and so he just takes them out. And I don't understand why that's so popular. Even my sister was watching it and she was telling me about it. And I think that's wrong. That's really, really wrong.
Well, it's interesting because we're in a point now in our society where discussion about, the moral gray areas are becoming more and more interesting and more layered. Even like think about some of the Batman. Batman is a perfect example of this. When Batman first came out, he was the Lone Ranger. He was the good guy. He was the white hat. He always did the right thing. But then over time, they started to, the storylines with Batman started to get darker and darker. He became the Dark Knight. He became someone who had to do things that seemed wrong in order to do what was right. He had to do things because the government couldn't, because they had to stay above board. And now we've even got to a point where that's even beyond that, where the question is vigilante justice ever justified? Is it ever right to go under the radar or over the head of the government and make these kinds of decisions on your own about what is and isn't right or wrong? And so these are conversations that our society is having right now and that we're struggling with. And I think it's a good thing, but I also think that if we don't explicitly talk about them, then we are leaving our moral development up to people who have the power to tell the stories. And so like a story like Dexter isn't explicitly asking us to think about whether that's right or wrong, because they create this character that is a positive character. And so then it is implicitly teaching us that vigilante justice is justified as long as the person is doing it, with really bad guys, in his opinion and in our opinion, because the story is told that way. So the ends justify the means. And that is very dangerous if you don't talk about it. If you don't really think about it and get behind it, it's very dangerous. Same thing with like the Batman kind of stuff. And so I'm glad that those kinds of questions are coming up, but I worry that we're not doing enough work to make it meaningful.
There's a lot of television shows that have that theme, where the police do this or that or whatever. I think you're right. I think we need to talk about those things.
Yeah, superheroes are problematic.
Yes. Definitely.
Yeah, but I really like Batman.
They're fun. They're entertaining, but they're problematic. And I love some of these more recent Marvel movies where they get into some of that stuff. The Sokovia Accords, to talk about what all these superhumans can and can't do and try to limit them, because it's dangerous to have an individual with all this power, whether it's because they created it for themselves or they just got it by chance, like Spider-Man or Captain America or whatever. How do we control them? How do we prevent them from becoming the next dictator who decides for himself what is and isn't right?
Good point.
It's interesting. I like it. All right. Well, I think that's all we've got for today. I'll wrap us up here. What is Christian pacifism? Well, it's an anti-war or anti-violence philosophy at its heart that, of course, is based in the teachings of the Christian church and Jesus' teachings. It is not the same thing as pacifism. It takes a lot of work to be a pacifist in a violent world. Power is always maintained through war and domination in our world. And so how do you be a pacifist, but also still engage with that world? Some people say you don't, you become an anarchist. But others say you do, you stay and you fight and you challenge and you try to work through it. Christian pacifism has a lot of challenging implications about, how do we respond to extreme situations and real life challenges to our pacifism. And I think that an important question that we should ask ourselves is, does God want us to be pacifists? I think it's easy to say yes, based on some of the things that we read today, But I think in reality, it's a lot more complicated than that.
Mhm.
What does God ultimately want from us? I don't think that the ends justify the means just in any given situation. But I also think that God would say, you over there with your, pure as snowflakes, moral superiority are not doing what it is that I am calling you to do. You are not being the person that I created you to be. I think God wants us down in the muck and the mire and making hard choices and making mistakes and trying to use the life and breath and resources that we have in this world to make a difference, to help those who are in need, who are being oppressed. And to do that, you can't be an absolute pacifist. You can't sit back and let everybody else do what they're doing. But you also have to avoid, becoming that which you are fighting against, right? You can't fight oppression by becoming an oppressor.
Right.
So it's challenging. And my wrap it up passage for today is Romans chapter 12. If it is possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave room for the wrath of God. No, if your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they are thirsty, give them something to drink. For by doing this, you will heap burning coals on their heads. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. I love this passage because it's like passive aggressive Christianity. You will heap burning coals on their heads. But no, that's not what I really wanted to focus on with this. I think the message is, God, we need to trust God to make things right. We need to work, as it says, as far as it depends on you, to live peaceably with all, but maybe not always. Never avenge yourself, but it doesn't say never avenge others, because it's important for us to try to overcome evil for the sake of others. But do we do it by becoming evil ourselves? No. We do it by using good.
Right.
So how do we do that? I think is the complicated part. And then we also get the little side effect of being able to feel more morally superior to our enemies when we do something good and win out anyway. But that's just vindictive me.
This thing about the micro shelters, people like to complain about the homeless people. Hey, dogs. They like to complain about it. But isn't it better to do something to help them rather than just complain and say, I don't want them in my neighborhood?
I think so.
To be a pacifist. I'm sorry. My dog is just going nuts. But you can't be a pacifist in that respect. You have to do something to help people.
Yeah. And I'm not suggesting that we go and do violence against the people who are opposed to this idea. Sure, certainly.
No, I'm not either.
But I think that's an example of, do we all just sit back and try to get along with each other and never do anything that might hurt somebody else's feelings? Or do we actually do something about the problem? And then it's gonna get some panties in a bunch, but that's okay. All right, anything else, Jim?
Nope, I'm done.
All right. So next week, we're going to talk about what is the connection among Jews, Christians, and Muslims. So we'll talk a little bit about the biblical connections of those groups.
Good. This was really interesting today. I really touches my heart.
Good class.
Yeah.
Stuff.
Yeah.
All right. Well, everybody have a great weekend.
You
We'll
too.
See you on Sunday, Jim.
Yep. See you Sunday.
See you next week, Karen.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.